Well, hi everyone. This is Scott King over at Zimperium, and I am joined by my esteemed partner and colleague, Jacques Cares over at Guardsquare. And today we're going to talk about why your app may be not as secure as you think. So a little bit about our agenda today. We're going to give you an overview of a couple of pieces of research on over 3,000 mobile banking and financial services apps. We're going to provide some breach examples of what could happen if you don't properly secure your app, some app shielding best practices. We're going to review the OWASP Mobile Top 10 and how these apps graded against those compliance policies, some app rankings. So we did actually score them on a 0 to a 100 scale, and we'll provide you some numbers on how these apps actually ranked, some recommendations and resources, and then we actually have asked every one of the registrants if they had any questions today, and we had some questions submitted, so we're going to review those at the end. So Jacques, anything to open the session before we get started?
Yeah, definitely. When we did that report, this analysis of these applications, it was given by the fact that we saw some external researches which showed us that apps were not at all protected or very little protected. So let's say reports show that 75% of the apps were not fulfilling the basic security requirements. So then we said, okay, let's look into that a bit deeper and let's analyze that, and that's where we came up with that study. So keen to share more information on that.
Okay, nice. So first, I'd like to share a little bit about PSD2. So this is the Payment Services Directive. This is the second go around, and really this was driven because all of the banks and all of the consumers started using mobile devices for mobile payments. But I'd really like to call out a specific section in the PSD2, and specifically the Article 9 in the regulation states that you must put mechanisms in place to ensure that the software or the device has not been altered by the payer or by a third party. And Jacques, that third party could be anyone, right? So what are we protecting against?
Well, exactly. We protect against that information, which is then has to be shared by banks to third parties. That API, which is then shared, should be very well protected because it's going in the wild world, I would say. So that's why it is important. Another thing I would like to add is some say PSD2. Okay, it's a European directive regulation, but let's related to open banking. But we see that many countries around the world are also adopting that these same specifications. Some a bit slower than others, but we see that in Asia, in Middle East, and also in Latin America, where some countries are also applying the same regulations. So to say that it's only applicable to Europe, it's also a shortcut, I would say.
Yeah, I think that is it's a good point, Jacques. PSD2 does have a ripple effect, as does GDPR. So you'll see other countries, specifically in the U.S. here, the California Consumer Privacy Act really followed on from the lead of GDPR. So same thing with PSD2.
Yeah, indeed.
So first off, I want to talk about a little bit about what can happen to your app if someone is looking for information from it. So here we've got, lack of obfuscation can lead to static reverse engineering. So, really what are attackers looking for? They're looking to gain insight on critical process. They're looking for vulnerabilities that they can exploit. And really what they're doing is, they're looking to bypass any security software that you may have in your app. How can they find embedded credentials? And then on the bottom left-hand side, these are some of the tools available to hackers and to reverse engineers on how they can attack your app and how they can inspect it for vulnerabilities and maybe accidental information that is left behind. And Jacques, we have a couple of real-world examples that where this has actually happened over at Tesco and Bitfi.
Yeah. Let me add one thing here, is that, okay, we talk about lack of obfuscation, which in static protection, but it has also its impact on the dynamic protection, because we will talk to that about that a bit later. But we see that if your static protection is not okay, it will also influence your dynamic protection. But we will come to that later.
Oh, exactly, exactly. One of one of the most notable examples where a mobile app was reverse engineered in order to steal money from a bank was Tesco Bank. So essentially, what happened is, weaknesses in the mobile app. It displayed information to the attackers. Credentials and API logins. So essentially, what happened is they discovered some information. They went in overnight, stole £2.5 million of customers' money from over 9,000 different accounts, all overnight. They've never been caught. And the fine for this was pretty severe, £16.4 million for failing to exercise due skill and care. Any comments on this, Jacques?
No, it's a good example of where, because sometimes you say, okay, it's about stealing credentials and information which can be reused. Here we really talk about money which was stolen. So that's an example which speaks to the imagination, I would say.
Yeah, that probably really hurt who was ever in charge of that. So I feel for them. Another example was a BitFi wallet. So this is a Bitcoin wallet. It was actually hacked twice. They put out a bug bounty and offered to pay attackers that could get into the app, and they were actually able to get into the app quite easily. Turns out the BitFi didn't actually want to pay the bug bounty after this was done twice. So pretty interesting.
Indeed.
Another area that we at Zimperium get a lot of questions about is bank impersonations, overlays, and specifically BankBot. So these attacks leverage malicious mobile apps. They get them on your phone. The malicious mobile app can then inspect which other applications you have on your device. If they see a mobile banking app, then they go and fetch the image when you attempt to log in, place that over your mobile app, and you actually surrender your credentials directly to the attacker without you knowing it. So these are specifically crafted apps, and the malware is specifically crafted for specific banks. You can look up a list of banks that are actually targeted. If you're interested, if your bank is targeted on this attack, you can ask me later, or Google it and Google your bank name and BankBot and see if you're on a list. Yep. So really dangerous, and users don't know really don't know that they're succumbed to this attack, right, Jacques?
Yeah, indeed. And it's amazing to see that if you figures are available about the 2018, where they saw an increase over a year of 200% of Trojans. So malware which has been installed, and also that same period saw an increase of 650% of the fake applications which are stored and available. So it means that there is a tremendous increase of that kind of malware or fake apps which are misleading the users, and could with a lot of consequences.
Yeah, and unfortunately, Jacques, the reason that you're seeing the increase in that type of activity is that the return on investment for an attacker to attack a banking app is high. It's upwards of 400%. So the level of effort taken to create these malwares and to create these overlay attacks, it pays off in the end. You can make 400% on your time and your money because these guys work in real shops and have daytime hours to construct this malware. And unfortunately, you and I have to help everybody defend their apps, right? Yeah, so in this instance, the malware that we looked at, specifically BankBot, 65% of the apps that we looked at were susceptible to BankBot attacks.
Yeah. Yeah, indeed, it's a bit worrying to see that figure, and Yeah, I mean, that's why we started to study ours and went into our study, which I will explain a bit more now. So what we did, we analyzed more than 3,000 Android applications of leading financial institutions all over the world, and these were some of the outcome, the results that we saw. That we saw over the different regions fairly the same amount of lack of protection. So from Africa over Europe and North America. So there is quite of a fairly steady amount to be noticed. We also did an analysis more on the industry, so the market. So if you can show that slide, where also there we see. Okay, there are a bit more discrepancies. We analyzed really banking apps, card applications, which were related to credit card application and such, and to payment and wallets. So we see a bigger increase on protection for wallet apps. That's probably historically explainable because many are related to card schemes, which are these guys are very strongly regulated, and they are already imposing very strong rules to themselves. MasterCard, Visa, Amex, so the EMVCo regulation. So in that sense, it's not a surprise that from all the markets, they are the best protected, I would say.
And then, yeah. Jacques, on that point, do you think that is because of the self-regulation from the card companies?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, it starts by PSD2. No, by PCI here. So they're imposing, and now we see also that these card schemes, of course, they cannot impose these regulations yet to their members, which they can for really payment applications. For mobile apps, they cannot yet. But what they do, they try already to secure their wallets, which they then offer to banks to install in their applications. So these mobile APIs or SDKs are strongly protected, and of course they are trying now into new regulations which are being developed on the EMVCo association to also impose that more and more, but it's not yet there, of course.
Interesting.
So that's if we sum that up, we see that a bit less than 50% have some obfuscation in place, which means that more than half of them don't have any protection against static attacks in place, which is kind of worrying. And if we then see the ones which have some protection in place, or pretend that they are 80% of that are using our open source product, which is called ProGuard, and that product is mainly an optimizer. Just a few words on that. The optimizer means that it shrinks and it makes the app faster, and that's a product which has been on the market since a very long time, because in the past, in 2001, 2002, when it was created, it was meant to really reduce the size, and because the smartphones were not that powerful. So that's, and we add a very thin layer of protection, of obfuscation, but that's really a very thin layer. And people think, okay, they have been using that. There is also mentioning about obfuscation, so they think, okay, that's more than enough, which is totally not the case, because that product is not meant for, has been developed for security reasons. So, and if you take that into account, it means that less than 10% of the applications of these financial institutions use a kind of a strong protection, which is a bit worrying.
Well, it's a very small number. So you're saying less than 10% actually use kind of a full obfuscation method, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Wow. Well, that is that is surprising. So as part of our research over at Zimperium, we took a look at the OWASP Mobile Top 10, and so these are a set of practices that that developers follow. And what we did is we actually scaled all of the apps together on a 0 to 100 percentile. So you can see at the top, improper platform usage, that bar is completely green. So that means 100% of these apps pass for that rule there. And then you can follow on down the line. The red means failure. So M2, insecure data storage. So really, unintended data leakage is things that we're looking for. 97% of those apps actually fail for that. And you go on down the line, and you look at M9, which is reverse engineering. And that was really the point of today's presentation was, how can I shield or harden my app from being reverse engineered? 100% of the iOS apps in our study actually failed for reverse engineering. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't have any type of obfuscation. That means there are exposures in the app that can be exploited. And those would include code and APIs. So if you leave an API open, obviously that exposes some information. Otherwise, the app couldn't, if you obfuscated that, the app couldn't communicate correctly to external sources. So you need to have extra checks on your API security as well. Now, if we move to Android, the chart looks a little bit different. Insecure data storage, less apps fail for that. Insecure communications, less apps fail for that. But again, on reverse engineering, 100% of the apps fail. So, you really just need to take a look at, why you're failing. Make sure that you're comfortable with the reasons that the reporting mechanism is telling you that you're failing. And if you're not comfortable with it, do some further research to make sure that you're not exposing your app and your assets and your connections to attackers out in the wild.
A small comment there, if I may, Scott. You see that the same failures are appearing on the iOS as on the Android. Okay, there are some differences, but so that's something where we come often across some comments to say, people to say, okay, but yeah, Android, okay, I can understand, but iOS, it's secure, so I don't need to worry, which shows that it's not really the case, and also other studies are really indicating that today we can say that out of 10 Android applications which are being hacked, 6 iOS apps. So it's really catching up, and to say that the iOS community is safe, it's totally incorrect.
Yeah, it really is. And, when you talk about APIs and connections, both apps use the same connection. The protocols themselves, sometimes there's a vulnerability in the protocol itself. For instance, Wi-Fi or Bluetooth or NFC, and that is not platform dependent. And then also with with Android, the fragmentation may help you a little bit in terms of an exploit constructed for a certain operating system is only good for a smaller percentage, whereas for iOS, about 75% of the devices are kept up to date, whereas 25% are not. So it really depends. It's always an argument, but you really need to look at really the protocols itself and supply chain attacks. Take a look at MageCart. That's not platform dependent either. All right, so here is our scatter chart for privacy and security risk scores for the iOS mobile banking apps in our sample. So the scores are from a 0 to a 100 scale on both privacy and security. So the apps represented in the lower left-hand corner are the most secure and have the least chance of leaking data through the app. The apps on the upper right-hand corner, where you get closer to 100, these apps are most susceptible to data leakage, and they have higher scores for security, which means that in the weighted average and how these scores are calculated, the more problems you have, the higher your score. And some of these are, related to authentication methods. You can override SSL or TLS chain validations. About a quarter allow unsecured and unverified connections to servers with lower TLS versions. There are a high percentage in this chart that implement swizzling API calls that could be manipulated. And there's non-secure HTTP proxies in here. There's private access frameworks for iOS, and again, some have additional libraries in the app that shouldn't be there. So if you'd like to take a look at a little bit on why these are, the exact reasons and the exact percentages, just download the research and you can take a closer look. Same here with the Android. So 0 to a 100 score from platform to platform, from iOS to Android. They don't make sense to compare each other, but depending on platform, so inside of Android, you'll notice that the dots move, the pattern, if I go back and forth, the pattern is a little bit different. But what you want to look at is, your app relative to the others. Some of the Android apps in the upper right-hand corner, some of the problems, 90% of the apps enable WebView to execute JavaScript code. If the app is connecting to a bank's website to show pages in the app, the bank's website uses JavaScript, that is a different reason, but however, it's best not to use JavaScript in there. Many of these apps use insecure data storage. They actually use world writable data stores in the app. And then two of these apps scored really, really high because they have an additional Android application bundled inside the mobile banking app. So definitely need to take a look at that and understand why that is there. And again, if you want additional detail, just take a look at the research, and we'll provide that link to you at the end of the session. So, Jacques, yep. What's some best practices and recommendations for our audience today?
Yes. Okay. So there are different things which need to be done or can be done without impacting your user experience, and that's first of all to apply multiple obfuscation techniques. We already saw that many apps are not obfuscated and encrypted. So to use these techniques, that's definitely an important thing. We also talk about RASP, so the runtime protection mechanisms and the detection of threats, but you have to see that in a combination, because we've seen in the past, and there is a famous example of a German big bank, savings banks, which was hacked ethically, luckily for them. They were implementing a fairly strong RASP protection, but they didn't protect the against static attacks, so no obfuscation or very little obfuscation, and the hackers were able to retrieve the intelligence of that RASP, and by doing so they could build malware to bypass these protections. So a combination of two is really important, and yeah, of course, it's important to use that, to take that into account in your development cycle, so that people invest a lot in their user interface, and which is right, of course, because that's key in the experience that the customer has with that application. But if they forget to implement all the security, which doesn't have to be so time consuming, but if they forget, then the risks can be tremendous, and that's why we can only advise to spend some time and some budget on implementing these obfuscation and RASP techniques. And then also the database remediation, that's also important, because there they can gather information on how they can improve their protection based
Yeah,
on feedback.
your German example, Jacques, goes back to what we talked about earlier with the understanding security checks and security methods inside your app. So it sounds like these guys weren't hiding their methods very well and were exploited. So hopefully no harm. You said it was an
Yeah,
ethical hack, so
yeah,
no harm, right?
no, indeed.
All right, good. Good.
So I don't know if you have other things to add there, or
Yeah, I mean, just as essentially, I would say, don't take, your current state for granted. Just find, research why your app scores the way it does. Make sure that you're comfortable with it, because many of the apps that we looked at are, multiple versions old, right? And
yeah,
teams change, methods change. So, you could have code in there that is either deprecated. For instance, there, inside our research, there is a deprecated SDK used by about 12% of the apps, and it's completely vulnerable. You can download exploits for it on the internet, yet it still lives on in subsequent versions of the app, because really no one's just taking a look at it. So it's really dangerous. And if I can find it, then somebody else can very easily.
mm-hmm. Yeah,
But
indeed.
so some of the research that we used today is available on the internet. You can download the full financial application security report from Guardsquare. The mobile banking apps are not created equal from Zimperium, and we'll supply these links to you as well in the follow-up email, so you don't have to try and write those down. And so we did have some questions, Jacques, on registration, and I believe we have one extra question today. I'll take a look at that.
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So we had people register for this presentation, and one of the questions that came in, which OWASP guidelines can we use to make our Android app highly secure yet very friendly to use? So Jacques, what do you have to say about that?
Well, there are guidelines available which are clearly stating what best practices are, and of course by using some obfuscation and RASP techniques, they can definitely help. We can provide these guidelines in more detail if we have the that's available, but we can share. It's also available on our website. So yeah, I don't know if you have other comments to make on that.
Yeah, I mean the usability and security is a fine line, but you have to make it friendly to use. If users don't use your app and don't give you good reviews in the App Store and Play, then if you leave a bad review, I know that Google just implemented some algorithm changes on reviews. They're using more recent reviews in terms of weighting, so it pushes your app down. Plus, I'm sure people are measured on this that actually developed this app. So.
But what's important to add there is that the OWASP guidelines don't need to impact the user friendliness. It can be totally, so it's not by adding security in line with the guidelines that you will decrease the user friendliness of your application. At least with using with our tools, it really doesn't have to be. So that's an important thing to add.
Right. Yeah, they're not dependent. The only way to have 100% security would be to not have a mobile app, and then not having a mobile app is completely unusable. So there's a line in there somewhere.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So second question, Jacques, that we had, what is the business impact if the banks need to limit their customer transactions from a compromised mobile device?
No. Well, I would say there the good thing is that by installing some RASP and some monitoring, they can, of course, avoid any impact. And when alerts, they can, if they install, let's say, alerts on let's say hooked devices and things like that, so that information can be programmed so that they can put the boundaries where and what they want to do, because often these devices, hook devices, are not necessarily damageable, or don't have very severe malware. It could be. So there it's up to the bank to and with the software that we propose, they are able to put their the different boundaries of what they want to do, if they want to block the application, if they want to let it go, or something in between. So that's really the good thing, is that it can be monitored upfront, and rules can be put in place. And then if you add monitoring, that's even more powerful, because then you can monitor that more closely, I would say.
Yeah, I really appreciate this question from whoever asked this, because they talk about the business impact of limiting a transaction. It really is a business decision. But as a developer, you have to enable that data to be read by the business. So if you don't have any checks or any detection in your app that will actually detect a compromised device, you cannot provide that data back to the business. So I think that would be number one, is you have to have some type of mobile threat defense and detection inside of your app, therefore that produces that data, right? So we talked about the data-based remediation decisions on the previous slide. This goes directly from that. So you have to have something inside your mobile app to detect that on a third-party device. So this is an unmanaged device that your user is using. So I really like that question.
And in the meantime, have already something in place, because when the app is out there, I mean, when you program that and configure the security tools, you can already define some business rules which you have agreed with the business units on. If this, then we apply that, and that's already a check and a security mechanism. And then if you monitor, then you have a strong ecosystem, I would say.
Okay, and then so we've got some more questions, Jacques, that are coming in, and I'll take a look at those. The last question that was submitted before the session: how can we enhance security within a patient app that communicates with medical devices? Same way. So you really need to be securing any type of medical app, specifically with patient information, that you don't want it, one, to be reversed on the patient's device. So who knows what the health of the patient device is. And communicating with medical devices, a lot of times, like I said earlier, the protocols themselves are vulnerable. So any communication in between the app and the medical device is susceptible for hacking. There are examples on the internet where people have they've broken into pacemakers and things like that that are actually internal to somebody's body, and manipulated it, like unlocking a car with a mobile app.
Yeah, indeed.
So some of the other questions that have come in, Jacques, as an iOS developer starting on Android, is there a development or checklist guide on implementing secure Android applications? And what do you think about SSL pinning? So yes, I do have a checklist. We're not going to talk about it today. And SSL pinning, yes, I recommend it. And I also recommend some type of man in the middle and network attack type of defense as well.
Yeah, I agree. And the checklist, yeah, we can communicate that to people. We can put that available.
Yeah, I've got your email address, so I'll send you the checklist. It's in another presentation. And then last question for today, Jacques. I know the answer to this one because we do this type of research. Do you see other types of apps that are more or less secure? Actually, yes, we have 3 other research pieces on travel apps, shopping apps, and tomorrow there will be dating apps. And yes, some are more or less secure. I will say that the financial services apps, even though they are pretty scary, they tend to be most secure because actually they get most resources assigned to them. There's bigger teams. So Jacques, thank you very much for joining me for this presentation today. I really appreciated your insight on the Guardsquare research. Any closing thoughts?
No, thank you for the invitation, Scott. Yeah, I'm open to answer further questions, and you have my email address, so do not hesitate to drop a mail.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, if you have any further questions, go ahead and ask them directly to Jacques or myself. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, all of you. Bye-bye.